For better or for worse, video games were social networks before social networks were social networks. Really. Last time on my video game history series, The Save Files, we talked about the one generation in console history where all four major players were in the ring at once. Sony dominated. Microsoft made an entrance, Nintendo wrestled with its identity, and Sega called it quits for consoles. But if Generation 6 was about the industry growing up alongside the gamers who love it, Generation 7 was about what happens when you hand a grown-up hobby a live internet connection. It didn't always go so well. I'm Owen, the friendly Xennial gamer, and this is The Save Files, the Console Wars Generation 7, The Rise of the Fanboy. To understand the 7th generation of consoles, the PS3, the Xbox 360, and the Nintendo Wii, we have to consider the moment that they were born into. The Xbox 360 launched in November of 2005. The PS3 followed a year later in November of 2006, along with the Nintendo Wii. And here's what that moment looked like in the broader world. Facebook had just opened up beyond college campuses. Twitter didn't even exist yet. The first iPhone? Steve Jobs wouldn't even announce it until January of 2007, more than a year after the Xbox 360 hit store shelves. Let's just sit with that for a second. The platforms and the mobile devices that would define communication and social networking as we know them today, they were either brand new or hadn't been invented yet. But right there in our living rooms, Microsoft and Sony were building something that looked a lot like a social network. Xbox Live on the 360 gave you a friends list, a universal gamer identity, voice chat, messaging, leaderboards, the ability to jump in and out of each other's games. PlayStation Network on PS3 offered its own version of the same. These weren't afterthoughts, these were central to what these consoles were and the generation they represent. Think about that. Gaming got to social networking before social networking did. Before most people had ever sent a tweet or even updated their Facebook status from their phones, millions of gamers were logging on, headsets ready, talking trash to strangers, and playing games with friends across the country and the world. We were doing it at scale with relatively reliable performance years before the rest of the tech world would catch up. So if you ever needed proof that gaming is a major cultural force and not a niche hobby or a kid's pastime, the 7th generation of consoles is Exhibit A. This industry was building out the infrastructure of online community and social identity before Silicon Valley had even finished figuring out what to do with it. It's pretty cool, right? Well, yes, and also very much no. Because here's the thing about being on the cutting edge of internet technology, you also get to be first in line for all of its downsides. And the gaming community, bless its passionate, argumentative, deeply sincere heart, dove headfirst into the worst of it. Once you put the gaming community online with strangers and gave them anonymity, then handed them a platform where they could argue about their preferred piece of consumer electronics at all hours of the day and night, you got something that the world hadn't seen yet, or at least not in a while, and not this bad. You got the fanboy. And I don't mean the enthusiastic fan who loves a thing, that can be quite charming. I mean the fully online, anonymous, take no prisoners, my console is better than your console, and I will die on this hill fanboy. The hero that nobody needed, nobody asked for, and nobody wants around their internet forums. See, before this generation, the console wars had always been friendlier. You argued with your neighbor about whether Sonic or Mario was better. You debated with your college roommate about whether the N64 or the PlayStation had better games. It was personal, it was couch level, and it was bounded by geography. The person you were arguing with was someone you knew, and that meant that there were sort of limits on how unhinged things could get. But then the internet removed all of those limits. All of a sudden, forums and message boards were packed with people who had never met each other, arguing with an intensity that was completely disproportionate to the stakes. Which console had better graphics? Which online service was superior? Which exclusives mattered more? Which of these two identical-seeming entertainment boxes made you a better, smarter, more legitimate human? And look, I get it. Passion is passion. I've been a deeply irresponsible consumer of gaming hardware my entire life, and I understand the attachment. But the 7th generation is when that passion curdled into something uglier online, and it cast a long shadow over gaming culture that we're still dealing with in many ways today. And while gaming didn't invent online toxicity, it was one of its earliest proving grounds. And the irony of that is rich. This 7th generation that first made gaming feel genuinely grown up, mature narratives, modern level graphics and features, sophisticated online infrastructure, cultural legitimacy, was also the generation that introduced some of the least grown-up behavior that the hobby has ever seen. But the irony gets even thicker because in the end, this generation was dominated by the platform that created a new social experience that didn't require us to be online at all. So welcome to the 7th generation, let's talk about the actual consoles. Microsoft came into the 7th generation with something that they hadn't had the last time around: momentum. The original Xbox had moved 24 million units, respectable for a debut, even though Sony had lapped them twice over with the PS2. This time, Microsoft made two decisions that would shape the entire generation. First, they launched a full year ahead of the competition. The Xbox 360 hit North American shelves on November 22nd, 2005, a year before the PS3 and the Wii, which gave them a massive head start in install base and software library. Second, they priced aggressively. The core system launched at just $299, with a premium version with a hard drive and wireless controller at $399. When Sony eventually revealed the PlayStation 3's price, $499 for the base model, $599 for the premium, both with hard drives at different sizes, Microsoft's gamble on price looked absolutely brilliant. And right out of the gate, the 360 was excellent, innovating over the original Xbox console in every way imaginable. No longer a giant black box, the 360 felt more like a friendly appliance, and the games at launch were dynamite, and the controller was really something special, sort of a best of all worlds between the DualShock size and the original Xbox Duke that had come before it. It really still to this day is one of my favorite. And I got a 360 on launch day. I was a broke theater kid, freshly out of college and living in New York City, and coincidentally working at GameStop at the time, on the kind of income that makes you very creative about what you can and can't afford. So when my buddies and I looked at the Xbox 360 at $299 versus the coming PS5 at $4 or $599, the math wasn't complicated. Xbox 360 it was. And I wasn't disappointed. The system was sharp, the controller was comfortable, Halo was Halo, and Xbox Live felt like the future. The friends list, the achievement system, the ability to jump in a party with people across the country, it worked, and it worked really well. But then, within just a couple of months, I got my first red ring of death. For the uninitiated, the original Xbox 360 had a hardware problem, a significant one. The console had been rushed to market, production began just 69 days before launch. And in the process, Microsoft had made some cost-cutting decisions on the graphics chip that they would use that would come back to haunt them spectacularly. The culprit, as independent investigators eventually identified, was a combination of a custom-designed GPU and the wrong type of lead-free solder. The kind that, when exposed to extended heat, becomes brittle and develops hairline cracks that are essentially irreparable. And Microsoft knew that the failure rate was high. They just rolled the dice anyway. The result became one of gaming's most infamous hardware disasters. The 4 green lights around the 360's power button were your signal that all was well, but if 3 of those lights turned red, that was the red ring of death. And it meant your console was done. Sometimes there were warning signs. Your screen would glitch, you'd hear a terrible whirring sound, and sometimes the console just died midstream, mid-session, without any warning. There was no coming back from the red ring. Your console was just toast. Now, failure rate estimates vary widely, anywhere from roughly 24% according to the warranty provider SquareTrade, to a staggering 54% according to a Game Informer survey of 5,000 owners. In that survey, nearly 70% of Xbox 360 owners said that they had at least one friend who had had a console that died. Whatever the true number, it was catastrophically beyond any industry norms. And it cost Microsoft $1.5 billion to address. In July 2007, Xbox chief Peter Moore issued a public apology and announced a 3-year extended warranty covering any console showing the red ring, including free shipping both ways and reimbursement for anyone who had already paid for repairs out of pocket. Now me, personally, I went through 7 Xbox 360 consoles. 7, I'm not exaggerating. I had bought a Best Buy protection plan that through some miraculous loophole reset every time you exchanged a defective console. Some of mine lasted literally days, some of them lasted almost an entire year. And the last exchange I ever made, a manager at the Best Buy who recognized me came over and scribbled something on my receipt about how this was the last one. Well, the joke was on him, it didn't end up mattering, that was the last one I would ever end up needing anyway. But one of my best friends challenged me to see how few words I could use to actually make that exchange the last time, and I got it done in 3. Broken, red light. The associate was already moving, and I had clearly pissed the manager off with my immature hijinks. The tragedy is that the Red Ring debacle genuinely held Microsoft back from what could have been a dominant generation. The 360 was priced right, positioned right, and launched right. Xbox Live was a hit, and in the US market, it ultimately sold more units than the PS3. That would have been unthinkable a generation earlier, but without the hardware crisis, those numbers could have been way bigger, because a lot of customers that might have gone with the Xbox 360 hesitated, and you couldn't blame them. But still, the software delivered. Gears of War arrived in 2006 and became the best-selling game of the year. Halo 3 launched in September 2007 and became the biggest entertainment launch in history at that point. Not gaming history, entertainment history. Mass Effect, Fable 2, a big Call of Duty exclusivity deal just as the series was breaking out, the 360 had an embarrassment of riches. And in the early years of the generation, for reasons we'll get into later, cross-platform games generally played better on the 360 than they did on the PS3. And while they were now charging a subscription fee for it, Xbox Live had become the model for what effective online multiplayer would look like in the console space. So for me, despite the red rings, despite 7 consoles, and despite a Best Buy manager with a grudge, I'd do it again. I'm glad I went with the Xbox 360 for this generation, and it remains one of my favorite consoles of all time. Microsoft came into the generation with some momentum, and despite a serious hardware fumble, they grew their market share exponentially beyond what it had been in their previous debut generation. Now, for their part, Sony came into the 7th generation with the most dangerous thing that a dominant company can have: overconfidence. They had enjoyed 2 straight generations of dominance after selling 100 million PS1s and 160 million PS2s, the best-selling console of all time. Sony wasn't playing defense. They were building a supercomputer. Literally. PlayStation president Ken Kutaragi described his vision as a supercomputer for the living room, built around a custom processor called the Cell Broadband Engine that Sony co-developed with IBM and Toshiba. The PS3 was the first console with an HDMI port, the first capable of outputting games in full 1080p HD, and the first to use Blu-ray disc as its primary storage medium, which mattered enormously in the format war with HD DVD, which Xbox 360 had opted to go with instead. It was, without question, a technological marvel. It was also huge and really heavy. And it was also $599 in 2007. At a moment when Microsoft was sitting comfortably at $299 or $399, Sony had priced the PS3 at a point that made a lot of its most loyal fans genuinely reconsider. I was one of them. I had gone from PlayStation 1 to PlayStation 2 without a second thought. But $400 or $599 for a guy making theater money and retail money and living in New York City in 2007 was simply not an option. So it was the one console generation where I left Sony behind entirely. And I was not alone in that. The PS3 launched well in Japan and it sold out in the US initially, but sales dropped sharply in the weeks that followed launch as the price point took its toll. Sony was actually losing money on every single unit sold. Manufacturing costs were estimated at over $800 per console, meaning they were subsidizing every sale by $200 to $300. And the early software library was thin, making the price even harder to justify at launch. But despite that slowdown, Sony played a long game and it ultimately worked. The PS3 Slim launched in September 2009 at $299, a $300 price cut from launch without any technical compromises, and sales surged. And the library that had been thin at launch started to suddenly blossom into something genuinely extraordinary. God of War 3, the Uncharted series, Little Big Planet, and one of my all-time faves, The Last of Us. By the end of the generation, many gamers were arguing that PS3 had the superior exclusive library, and I can't personally dispute that even though I didn't own one at the time. I was kind of jealous. But when it comes to online gaming, Sony's story this generation was not entirely triumphant. In April of 2001, PlayStation Network was hit by one of the largest data breaches in history. Hackers accessed the personal information of 77 million PSN accounts, essentially every user, and Sony shut down the network entirely on April 20th, 2011. It stayed down for 23 days. So let's paint that picture properly. By 2011, tens of millions of PS3 owners had fully built their online ecosystem around PSN. That's where their friends were, their online games, and their multiplayer sessions. And then one day it was just gone for 3.5 weeks. And while it was gone, Sony took 6 days to publicly confirm what was going on and what had happened. They told users finally on April 26th that their personal data, including potentially their credit card information, may have been compromised. That delayed disclosure drew sharp criticism from governments in multiple countries. But to be fair, Sony's eventual response was genuinely decent. 2 free game downloads, a free month of PlayStation Plus, and a year of identity theft protection. The total cost to fix the damage came to $171 million. But the damage to trust lingered. In the 3 weeks that the system was down, a lot of PS3 users were looking over at their friends with Xbox 360 and realizing that the water was just fine over there. Nevertheless, Sony's PS3 was an incredible games machine, and despite that online fumble, PlayStation Network was generally pretty excellent and was available without any subscription fee. PS3 and Xbox 360 both had an incredible game library by the end of the generation. Honestly, playing these systems this week has kind of made me feel like this was the last big generation to take a real leap forward from one gen to the next, because playing these games is pretty similar to what we do on our couches every day these days. But we're not done with the 7th generation just yet. We've still got the king of Gen 7 to talk about. And that king was ready to get us off the couch despite basically creating the video game hobby decades earlier. Enter Nintendo Wii. Nintendo had endured commercial disappointments with both Nintendo 64 and GameCube. They were both profitable thanks to their first-party software and efficient manufacturing, but both were eclipsed by PlayStation and raw sales. So Nintendo arrived at the 7th generation facing a choice. They could try again to compete with Sony and Microsoft on horsepower, on online infrastructure, and on the same battlefield that they've been losing on for 2 generations. Or they could change the game entirely. And they changed the game. The Nintendo Wii launched in North America on November 19th, 2006, 3 days after the PlayStation 3. It was priced at just $249 and it came bundled with Wii Sports in every territory except Japan. And if you were there, you know exactly what happened next. Because the Wii was not a more powerful version of what had come before, it was something new entirely. The Wiimote, a motion-sensing controller that you held like a TV remote and physically swung, pointed, and tilted to control gameplay, completely reframed what a video game controller could be. Nintendo wasn't asking you to learn a new button layout this time. They were asking you to get up and move. And the genius and simplicity of Wii Sports cannot be overstated. 5 sports: tennis, baseball, bowling, golf, boxing, all controlled by physical motion, all immediately intuitive. And all designed so that anyone could pick up a Wiimote within seconds and understand the basic idea. It was the perfect showpiece for the console. Nintendo of America president Reggie Fils-Aime had pushed to include it with every console, believing it would spread by word of mouth. And he was right. Wii Sports went on to be in 82.9 million households, making it, as a standalone title, one of the best-selling games in history. And I can remember putting a Wiimote in all sorts of family members' hands for the first time, many of whom had never played a video game before. I remember watching a buddy of mine's grandmother roll a strike on her very first frame and then look over at her grandson with the purest sense of delight that I'd ever seen from someone holding a video game controller. That moment was happening in living rooms across America and across the world. A Nintendo survey found that 68% of Wii Sports players had never owned a video game console before. So Nintendo had found an audience that Sony and Microsoft didn't even know existed. And in the time of the rise of social media, the Miis were a masterstroke. Creating a little cartoon avatar of yourself and then seeing it pop up in games, wave at you from the Wii menu, and interact with other people's Miis gave the console a whimsical personality that was just instantly charming. And speaking of charming, there were no shortage of delightful accessories. Mario Kart Wii put a steering wheel accessory in your hands. Wii Fit put a balance board under your feet. And the more traditional games were still great. The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess launched alongside the system. Super Smash Bros. Brawl arrived in 2008. The library was distinctly Nintendo. Imaginative, family-forward, endlessly playful. And it was completely unlike anything that serious gamers were doing over on Xbox 360 and PS3. And you can see the Wii's influence everywhere in what came after it. The willingness to pick up a plastic guitar for Guitar Hero or Rock Band, the cultural permission to hold a non-traditional controller and just play, I don't think that happens without the Wii first. And a motion control arms race followed, with Microsoft's Kinect and Sony's Move both releasing later in the generation. They were a direct response to what Nintendo had done, but neither matched the elegance or the cultural penetration of the Wiimote. Kinect was technically impressive, but its latency undermined it for most games, and PlayStation Move felt like an accessory in search of a purpose. But the fact that both companies felt compelled to respond at all tells you everything about how significant the Wii's intervention had been. Now, Nintendo's Achilles heel in the 7th generation, though, to the extent that they had one, was online gaming. PSN and Xbox Live were building genuine social ecosystems. Friends lists that carried across games, robust multiplayer opportunities, and digital storefronts that made it easy to access your library. Nintendo Wii's online functionality existed, but it felt secondary, like something that they'd done because they had to rather than because they were really committed to it. The Wii felt most at home with friends in the same room, the original social gaming experience, but this time on our feet, which, if I'm honest, led to some of my very favorite memories from this generation. But as the era grew to a close and online gaming became part and parcel to how so many gamers lived their gaming lives, Nintendo's underinvestment in that area became something of a conversation that would linger beyond the Wii. Still, 101 million Wii units sold. It was the generation's winner, and it wasn't particularly close. PS3 and Xbox 360 had both sold about 85 million consoles, and Nintendo had topped them each by 15 million. And Nintendo had done it by refusing to fight the battle that everyone expected them to fight. They had gotten innovative, and they had notched a 7th generation win right when they needed it most. And by the time the 7th generation wound down, each of the 3 platforms had been transformed by what they'd been through. Microsoft had survived the Red Ring debacle and built the most compelling online gaming ecosystem of the era. Xbox Live had become the blueprint. The achievement system, party chat, and seamless online multiplayer, those were Microsoft's gifts to the generation, and the industry adopted them wholesale. They had also beaten Sony in the important US market for the first and so far only time. It was genuinely Ali versus Frazier that generation. 2 credible, full-throated fan bases going at it over the internet. Sony had survived a brutal launch price, recovered with the Slim, survived the PSN breach, and delivered one of the greatest exclusive software libraries in gaming history. They ended the generation at 87 million units worldwide, down significantly from PS2's 160 million, but still slightly ahead of Xbox globally, and with a fan base that had been forged in the fire of fighting back from behind. And the PS3 was a powerful enough machine that the US Air Force has actually confirmed use of it in applications for their operations. Just wild. But the original champion, Nintendo, well, they'd won the generation outright with 101 million Wii's sold. They had redefined who gaming was for and had showed the industry that innovation could beat horsepower. But they'd also quietly failed to build the online infrastructure that would carry them forward, a lesson that it would take more than one console generation for Nintendo to fully learn. And for those of us that lived through it, the Xennials, Gen Xers, and Millennials that had grown up blowing into cartridges, this generation really marked something of a transition. Gaming wasn't something we did in the living room with roommates anymore, it was something we did with headsets on, connected to people across the country and world, long after everyone in the apartment had gone to bed. And it was an era when some truly great and enduring games first came to market. Games a lot of us still play every day today. The Elder Scrolls Skyrim, Grand Theft Auto 5, Red Dead Redemption, Mass Effect, The Last of Us. Gamers were eating extraordinarily well during the 7th generation. But as we put down our online roots, we also learned something about what the internet does to passion when it's left unsupervised. It leads to fanboys. The tribalism that would define so much of online gaming in the years ahead, the toxicity, the harassment, the exhausting binary of console preference, all of it traces back to this generation, to those headsets, that first taste of anonymity, and the intoxicating feeling of having an audience. The 7th generation gave us so much in gaming, but it was also the most contentious that we'd seen yet, at least since the 4th gen war of the SNES and the Genesis. But that, as they say, is a story for next time on the Save Files. For now, I want to know, what's your best 7th generation memory? Did you go 360, PS3, both? Were you one of the 101 million people who brought a Wii home to swing a controller around? Drop your memories in the comments, I want to hear about them. Till next time, I'm Owen, the friendly Xennial gamer. Thanks so much for joining me for this edition of the Save Files. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, you can support the channel by subscribing, hitting like, and sharing to help new viewers find their way here. Thanks so much for watching.